Have you ever considered the possibility that Adam might not have been humanity's true starting point? Have you ever entertained the thought that perhaps the Garden of Eden represented not the dawn of everything, but rather the recovery phase following some kind of devastating catastrophe? And what if the sacred book you believed you understood completely is actually concealing a mystery of cosmic proportions hidden right there in its opening sentence? When we examine the original Hebrew text, Genesis 1:2 actually reads, "V'ha'aretz hayata," which translates more accurately as, "And the earth became formless and void." That particular phrase, tohu va-bohu, doesn't carry the meaning of raw potential or a creative blank slate waiting to be filled. It's a phrase that appears only a handful of times throughout all of Scripture, and every single time it appears, it signals divine judgment. Isaiah chapter 34 uses this exact phrase to describe a land that has been destroyed by the wrath of God. Jeremiah chapter 4 uses it to describe a city that has been reduced to nothing but ashes and ruins. Tohu va-bohu doesn't describe the initial stage of creation. Instead, it describes the aftermath that remains after desolation has swept through. So the real question we should be asking isn't, what did God create in Genesis 1:1, but rather, what happened that left the earth lying in ruins? This is precisely where what's called the gap theory begins to take shape. A growing number of biblical scholars, including some of the early church fathers, Jewish mystics throughout history, and modern theologians, have put forward the suggestion that between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, there existed a gap. Not just a gap in grammar or a sentence structure, but a gap in cosmic history itself. A period of time before Adam, a world that came into existence and then was judged. The character of God is such that he doesn't create chaos. Rather, he judges things into a state of chaos. Because Scripture tells us plainly that God is not the author of confusion, as we read in 1 Corinthians 14:33. And yet when we arrive at verse 2, what do we find? We find confusion, we find darkness, and we find a void. This raises an uncomfortable possibility that many would rather not consider. What if Genesis doesn't actually start with creation? What if it starts with divine aftermath, with a buried rebellion, with a war that was lost? One ancient Jewish tradition that can be found in early Midrashic texts makes the claim that the Almighty created multiple worlds before this one, and then he destroyed them. Why would he do such a thing? The answer given is because they were corrupted, because they were inhabited by rebellious spiritual beings. He created worlds and destroyed them again and again, until finally he created this one and declared it good. This is found in Bereshit Rabbah 3:7. Could it possibly be that the chaos we encounter in Genesis 1:2 is not a blank canvas at all, but rather the ruins of a previous creation? And if that's the case, what caused that destruction? Some of the early church fathers, including Origen and Augustine, engaged in speculation that it might have been connected to the fall of Lucifer, the original rebellion that took place in heaven, a cosmic war that spilled over into the visible world and left behind nothing but devastation and a darkened earth. The book of Ezekiel speaks about a glorious being in very specific terms. "You were in Eden, the garden of God, blameless until wickedness was found in you." That's Ezekiel 28:13-15. But here's what doesn't make sense. How was this being in Eden before Adam existed? When we look at Genesis 1:1, the text declares, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Yet when we arrive at the immediately following verse, we encounter something unexpected. The earth existed in a state described as without form and void, with darkness covering the surface of the deep. Does that sound like creation to you? Or does it sound more like the wreckage left behind after something has been destroyed? Something about this timeline doesn't add up, does it? Unless, of course, Eden, the first Eden, existed before Adam was formed. unless the fall of that angelic prince actually predates the fall of man. What if the true origin of Earth's chaotic state wasn't some natural event at all, but rather a supernatural judgment? If that proves to be true, then Adam was not humanity's beginning. He was a restart, a new beginning after something ended. He was not fashioned and placed into an empty world. He was planted right there in the ashes of a previous one. And suddenly, when you see it from this angle, the entire narrative shifts beneath your feet. Genesis becomes not simply a story about beginnings, but a redemption story from its very first breath. But who were these beings that walked the earth before Adam? And what role did they play in Earth's forgotten past? Get yourself ready, because in the next chapter, we're going to meet the ones Scripture calls the sons of God. And they were there before the foundations of the world were laid. Chapter 2. Before Adam, who roamed the earth? The book of Job gives us this intriguing verse. When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Job 38:7. But let's pause right here and think carefully. If Adam was humanity's first man, then who were the sons of God already present and rejoicing at the creation of the earth? This verse, hidden in plain sight within the book of Job, exposes a crack in our timeline, doesn't it? Before Eden was planted, before dust was transformed into flesh, there were others. They were watching, and they were celebrating. These sons of God, rendered as B'nai Elohim in the Hebrew language, appear not only in the book of Job, but also in Genesis chapter 6, scattered throughout the Psalms, and in the book of Daniel. They are not metaphor. They are not mythology dressed up as history. They are heavenly beings, angelic in nature, radiant in appearance, ancient in origin. But here's the critical point. Some of them did not remain loyal to their original purpose. The ancient book of Enoch, a text that was highly respected by early Jews and is even quoted in the New Testament, tells the story of a group known as the Watchers. Originally, these beings were sent by God to observe and to guard the earth. They were heavenly stewards, not demons, not fallen beings at the start, but trusted sentinels placed in positions of authority. But something changed along the way. The Hebrew language uses a specific phrase here, tohu va-bohu, and this exact combination of words appears elsewhere in the Scriptures only in contexts where divine judgment has fallen. So here's the question that almost nobody seems to be raising. What exactly was being judged before Adam ever drew his first breath? The book of Enoch names them and describes them with specificity. 200 of them, led by a chief whose name was Samjaza, descended onto Mount Hermon, and there, in that place, they broke the boundary that had always existed between the divine realm and the human realm. They looked upon the daughters of men, and they took them as their wives, and they taught them secrets, forbidden knowledge that had never been meant for mortal minds to possess. From this unnatural union came something that should never have existed. Not angel, not man, but hybrids, called the Nephilim. And it all began with an act of betrayal. They were not myths created by primitive cultures. They were rebels who carried heaven's DNA in their very being. The Watchers weren't monsters when they began their assignment. They were holy. They were ordained. They had been set apart for a purpose. But they abandoned their posts, didn't they? What began as guardianship gradually became obsession. What began as loyalty gradually turned into lust. And here's something worth considering. The very term watcher carries implications of surveillance, of protection, and of judgment. They were not simply passive observers sitting on the sidelines. They had authority. They had mandates given to them. Which means the world that existed before Adam wasn't simply empty and waiting. It was under management, under governance. Beings walked the earth before mankind ever took a step. Intelligent beings, powerful beings, and some of them fell from their positions. Some scholars who have studied this material carefully believe that these watchers may have been connected to the chaos that's described in Genesis 1:2. That their rebellion may have helped trigger the devastation that led to a void, darkened earth. Their fall was so catastrophic in its consequences that God would later imprison them in the abyss, bound in chains, held in gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day arrives. That's in Jude 1:6. But what if some traces of their influence are still lingering in our world? Ancient structures that shouldn't exist, forbidden technology that seems out of place, relics that don't match any timeline we've constructed. They walked the earth before us, and some people say they're still trying to find a way to return. So before you make the assumption that Adam was alone when he opened his eyes, ask yourself this question. What if he was actually placed into a world that was already haunted by what came before? Coming up next, we need to talk about who the Nephilim were and what made them so dangerous that God chose to flood the entire earth. Chapter 3. The Nephilim Invasion. The book of Job, chapter 38, tells us that when the Almighty laid down the foundations of the earth, the morning stars were singing in harmony, and all the sons of God were shouting with joy. But stop for a moment and think about this. Adam hadn't been created yet. So who exactly were these sons of God, and what were they witnessing in that moment? Is it possible that there existed a world before our world? A civilization that predates Adam, perhaps even a war that took place before Eden was planted? The scripture tells us there were giants in the earth in those days, and also afterward. Genesis 6:4. The Bible calls them Nephilim. But this word isn't just some poetic language chosen for dramatic effect. It comes from the Hebrew root naphal, which means to fall. They are literally the fallen ones. Not fallen in the way angels fell, not fallen in the way men stumble. Fallen like hybrids, born from an act of rebellion, shaped by a violation of divine boundaries. These were creatures that were never meant to exist, never meant to draw breath. Heavenly DNA combined with earthly wombs, resulting in unnatural power. The Nephilim were the offspring of the Watchers, those rogue sons of God who crossed the divine human boundary with full knowledge of what they were doing. And their purpose was not accidental or random. It was intentional corruption of the human race. These beings were giants in a physical sense, imposing in their stature, yes, but they were far more than just large people. They were violent by nature. They were predatory in their behavior. They were pollution given flesh and allowed to walk. Genesis 6:11 tells us that the earth was filled with violence. But the Hebrew word that's used for violence in this passage is Hamas, and it implies much more than simple aggression. It implies lawlessness, chaos, brutality on a scale that defies description. These giants didn't just threaten human civilization and its development. They threatened the very plan of God himself. Because in the beginning, God said, "Let us make man in our image." But what happens when that image is genetically hijacked and corrupted? The Nephilim were not just giants who inspired fear. They were a direct assault on the purity of humanity itself. They defiled bloodlines. They erased the boundaries that God had established. And they infected creation with something that could not be redeemed through ordinary means. Noah wasn't just a righteous man in terms of his moral character. He was genetically untouched by the corruption. Genesis 6:9 describes Noah as perfect in his generations. The Hebrew word used here is tamim, and it's the same exact word used to describe a spotless sacrificial lamb that has no blemish. This is not merely about moral character or good behavior. This is about purity of bloodline. Noah's lineage had not been corrupted by Nephilim influence running through his family tree. He was the last true man, the last uncorrupted vessel through whom God could continue his covenant with humanity. And so God made a decision, a terrifying cosmic decision that should make us pause. I will wipe mankind from the face of the earth. Genesis 6:7. The flood wasn't simply about sin in a general sense. It wasn't simply about judgment for bad behavior. It was about resetting the human genome itself. What if the serpent we encounter in the garden wasn't an intruder from outside, but rather a survivor of something that came before? This is the story that has been forgotten, the history that has been erased, the beginning that existed before what we call the beginning. And it all originates not in Genesis 1:1, but in the space that exists between two verses, a mysterious gap where something divine experienced a fall, and something ancient met its end. The world had become something unrecognizable, something God never intended. A hybrid landscape ruled by abominations that should never have drawn breath. The ark wasn't just a boat floating on water. It was a genetic safeguard, a protection system, a womb floating on the waters of divine wrath, carrying forward what was still pure. Every creature taken aboard that vessel was selected with precise purpose. Every pair was untainted by corruption. Every breath was preserved for restoration of what was meant to be. The Nephilim were wiped away in the flood. Or were they? Because Genesis 6:4 whispers something deeply chilling at the end of the verse. And also afterward. The Nephilim returned after the flood. How is that even possible? That mystery is darker than we might think at first glance. And it leads us into the next phase of human history, where giants walk among kings and mighty empires fall under their shadow. But first, we must understand something crucial. The flood was not simply an ending point. It was the beginning of something far more calculated and intentional. Was the flood merely a punishment, or was it a divine reset designed to save what remained human? In chapter 4, we open the door to the most controversial idea yet. Did God recreate the world as a way to quarantine what came before? Chapter 4, the flood as a divine reset. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Genesis 6:5. The earth wasn't just sinful in a moral sense. It was irreversibly altered at a fundamental level. A dark convergence had occurred, hadn't it? Spiritual rebellion combined with genetic corruption, producing a hybrid race that shattered the boundaries between heaven and earth. So God responded, and his response was not simply an act of judgment handed down from above. It was a cosmic reset, a complete restart. Welcome to Echoes of the Nazarene, where we approach the scriptures as though they were sealed scrolls waiting to be unlocked, where forgotten history intersects with prophetic mystery and divine revelation comes together. If you've ever felt deep down that there's something more beneath the pages you're reading, you're absolutely right. There is more, and we're going to uncover it together. So go ahead and subscribe, share this journey with others, and prepare yourself to see the Bible in a way you never have before. Because once you understand what existed in the ages before Adam walked the earth, you'll never be able to read Genesis with the same eyes again. Genesis 6:7 records these words, "I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, for I am grieved that I have made them." These are not the words of rage and uncontrolled anger. These are the words of a creator watching his masterpiece mutate into something unrecognizable, something he never intended. This wasn't just punishment being administered. It was surgery being performed. It was the mercy of starting over when nothing else could save what remained. The flood, that ancient global deluge, was a divine purge, a cleansing. It was a burial not just of wickedness in an abstract sense, but of an entire civilization, complete with its structures and knowledge. God didn't just flood sin and evil. He buried an entire civilization under the waters. We tend to imagine the flood as a boat bobbing gently on rain. But Scripture describes something far more terrifying than that. The fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of heaven were opened. Genesis 7:11. This was not gentle rain falling from above. This was violence coming from above and below simultaneously. A collision of divine judgment with tectonic upheaval on a scale we can barely imagine. Mountains were swallowed whole. Cities were erased from existence. Names were forgotten. Histories were drowned and lost. Try to imagine their towers standing tall, their technologies functioning, their languages being spoken. All of it gone within weeks, erased completely from memory, or so it seemed at the time. Because if the Nephilim had embedded themselves into the very fabric of civilization itself, then the flood was more than just a reset of humanity. It was a containment strategy designed to quarantine what couldn't be redeemed. Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives, 8 souls in total, were not merely spared by chance. They were preserved with intention and purpose. God was not randomly saving people who happened to be nearby. He was preserving the bloodline, the DNA, the seed that would ultimately carry forward to the Messiah. Because beneath all this destruction, there was still a plan in motion, an unbreakable covenant moving forward. In the midst of the chaos, there was choreography, divine orchestration. The ark was not just a rescue vessel built to save lives. It was a mobile garden floating through the waters of judgment, carrying forward what was still sacred and pure. Animals, yes, but also memory, also language, also destiny moving forward. Take a moment and let this settle in your heart. Everything that existed before the flood, every monument that stood, every voice that spoke, every king who ruled, every name that was known, is gone. An entire civilization buried not just in sediment and rock, but buried in silence, lost to history. But here's the twist that changes everything. Genesis 6:4 quietly tells us something disturbing. And also afterward. Which means the Nephilim came back somehow. The corruption survived in some form. The war wasn't over after all. And that raises a haunting question that demands an answer. What else survived the flood? What else remained hidden, waiting in the shadows, biding its time, preparing to return? In Chapter 5, we'll explore the traces they left behind, scattered across the world. Megalithic ruins that defy explanation, ancient myths that echo similar themes, and lost technologies that may be far more than legend or primitive imagination. The world before Adam didn't just fall and disappear. It may still be echoing through our world today in ways we haven't fully recognized. Chapter 5. Lost Civilizations and Forbidden Knowledge. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Ecclesiastes 1:9. We tend to think of ourselves as standing at the peak of human achievement, don't we? We tend to assume that modern civilization is the most advanced version of mankind that has ever existed on this planet. But what if we're not the first advanced civilization? What if we're actually the rebuild, constructed on top of someone else's ruins? Chapter 1. The Gap in Genesis. In the beginning, the Almighty created the heavens and the earth. But then the very next sentence disrupts the rhythm in a jarring way. And the earth was without form and void. Wait just a moment. What actually happened in the space between verse 1 and verse 2?